despite the long day at work.
You have awakened my lithium-ion power unit.
Able to read a good story. But of course, we must first set the mood. Let's relax. A nice cinnamon apple candle. Now remember, whenever you light a fire, always close the match. Now be careful. Twin flames are very dangerous. Keep your safety stopper nearby. And we can't forget to pour a cup of hot cocoa. Be careful, the water's boiling hot. Get yourself a nice big mug and a little bit of hot cocoa mix. Always properly dispose of your trash. Now gently pour the water in the mug. Not too much. You want to be able to stir. Gently stir it together. Add yourself a little bit of cream. And stir some more. You might have to bring your spoon up and down. I always put 3 marshmallows. 1, 2, 3. Aren't they just cozy? Give myself a little bit more room. Now let's see what story we'll read today. This is a good one. United States History, from Colonization to Reformation, by Noah Balque and Mr. David Bills. Our story takes place between 1607 and 1877. Three European nations, France, Spain, and England, settled in the not-so-New World, which is what we now call North America. The French colonized the northern land of modern Canada and alongside the Mississippi. The Spanish took the south, modern-day Mexico, and the British, England, took the central area, but more off to the east coast, the modern-day not-so-United States. Over time, political borders grew as these three groups would begin to war over, sell, and trade their territories until the political borders we now see today were established. Politics aside, let's begin our story in a place called Jamestown. The first British colonies were Jamestown, Virginia, established in 1607, and Plymouth, Massachusetts, established in 1620. After their establishment, 150 years would pass, and 11 more colonies would form and gain their own personalities, you could say. They grouped into what we now call the New England, Middle, and Southern colonies. New England produced lumber, fished, and whaled. The Middle colonies produced so much grain, we started calling them the breadbasket. Sadly, the South was filled with plantation, which used slaves to harvest cotton, tobacco, and other farm goods. The French and Indian War drove the mother country of Britain into debt. To attempt and relieve the debt, the British Parliament began taxing the colonies. Oh, what a mistake that was. The colonies already had resentment towards Britain due to their mercantilist policies, international trade. Rebellion spread like fire. The Boston Massacre, 1770. Crispus Attucks and 4 others shot dead. The Boston Tea Party, 1773, and more. Britain only fed the flames of rebellion with the Intolerable Acts in 1774. War broke out shortly after Thomas Jefferson and the Second Continental Congress wrote the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. The first battle was at Lexington and Concord, 1775. The Tide Turner was Saratoga, fought in 1777, and victory was won at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. Under the leadership of George Washington and the assistance of the French, Monsieur Lafayette, KG3, or King George III, was defeated. Washington warned, stay neutral in wars and don't allow political parties to form. They will only cause division. Remember that. Shays' Rebellion followed shortly after the colony's freedom was established. And this told the U.S. it was time to make a stronger constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation. In 1787, the new Constitution was written. The Articles have served their purpose. They got us through the war, and the Northwest Ordinance was established, the process of becoming a state. The people no longer had a need for it. The new and improved Constitution had 7 pillar ideals: republicanism, checks and balances, federalism, limited government, individual rights, popular sovereignty, and separation of power. Republicanism allowed them to vote for representatives. Checks and balances made sure that the 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, couldn't overpower one another and make a muck of the country. Somehow it happened anyways, but we're not going to talk about that. Back to the story. Limited government means the government can't control everything, and is how we have a partial free market economy. Individual rights allows all of its citizens their own rights. Popular sovereignty means in votes to help support republicanism, the majority rules. Separation of powers, meaning not one office has all the power over a district. Meaning the mayor of a city is not the only power. We have judges, city council members, so on and so forth. Back to the story. Federalists like Alexander Hamilton, who shot his shot, supported this constitution because it gave the central government power. On the other side of things, anti-federalists like Thomas Jefferson, who was coming home, eventually called Democratic Republicans, favored the Articles of Confederation because it gave the states more power. Remember what Washington said? Out the window. Anti-Federalists demanded the Bill of Rights, or the First 10 Amendments, be added to the Constitution to prevent government abuse. I mean, they were traumatized by KG3. Can you blame them? After the Constitution was ratified with the help of the Federalist Papers, the position of president began. The first five in order were Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. They were faced with domestic and foreign problems in what we call the early Republic period. Remember that? While these presidents attempted to follow Washington's precedents of neutrality, the nation was ultimately dragged into another war with the British in 1812 due to U.S. ships being attacked and sailors being kidnapped. In 1803, Jefferson acquired a large mass of land at what we now call Louisiana Purchase. This caused a bit of controversy because people felt as though the president shouldn't be allowed to make such a massive decision alone. I mean, that's like Miss Patterson just taking over from the dance hall all the way to the cafeteria and not telling Miss Cobb. Does that make sense to you guys? After the War of 1812, the U.S. was established as a superpower. With this title, we established the Monroe Doctrine and warned European nations that colonization of the Western Hemisphere would not be tolerated. That's better. This is when the not-so-United States started to show its true colors. In 1824, John Quincy Adams bribed his way to presidency and stole said position from Andrew Jackson of what was called the corrupt bargain. In 1828, Andrew Jackson would become the first common man to become president due to largely expanded suffrage laws and his victory over the British at the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812. Excuse me, I think it's time to sip some hot cocoa. That's really good. Like, this is actual hot cocoa, it's not just a prop. Wow, that's really good. Hold up. I think we can take another sip. Back to the story. Jackson attempted to give the government back to the common man, and the political party, formerly called Democratic Republicans, became known as Jacksonian Democrats, and later just Democrats. Around the time of Jackson's presidency, America became obsessed with the idea of manifest destiny and spreading west, which would in turn lead to a treaty with the British to get Oregon, a war with Mexico to get the Mexican cession, and ultimately to a gold rush in California. Around the same time period, 1830s to 1850, the United States started to become more industrialized and urbanized, largely due to the British blockade during the War of 1812 and our consumer-driven free market economy. Reform movements also began to spring up in the mid-1800s, largely due to the Second Great Awakening, imploring newly converted Christians to make the country more godly. These reforms included the abolitionist movement against slavery, women's suffrage, voting movement, temperance movement, stop alcohol, the education reform movements, workers' right reform movements, and a reform movement to better the treatment of the mentally ill. Most of this industrialization and reform was going on in the northern part of the country, and the South stayed focused on plantation agriculture, growing cash crops under slave labor. Ultimately, the issue of slavery would divide the nation in drastic ways despite the best efforts of Henry Clay Missouri Compromise of 1850. Missouri Compromise took place in 1820. The breaking point for the nation seemed to come when abolitionist Abraham Lincoln surprisingly won the presidency. In response to this, southern states led by South Carolina began to secede from the Union. In all, 11 states seceded from the Union and claimed themselves to be Confederate States of America. The war began at Fort Sumter, but the turning point came at the Battle of Gettysburg as Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces were beaten and driven back into the South. The Emancipation Proclamation was also a turning point in the Civil War due to the fact that it changed the purpose of the war. It was no longer just a war to keep the Union together, but also a war to end slavery. The Union, the North, would ultimately win the war in 1865 at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, with Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. Soon after the surrender, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. While the North had succeeded in keeping the nation together by winning the war, the South now had to totally, socially, politically, and physically rebuild. This period is known as the Reconstruction era. Remember that? There was much debate as to how the South should be treated after the Civil War. President Andrew Johnson favored a very lenient plan, but was overruled and ultimately impeached by the radical Republican Congress that was determined to punish and reform the South. Under radical Republican Reconstruction, the South was divided into districts, placed under military rule, forced to change their state constitution, and also forced to pass the 13th, abolish slavery, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which gave African Americans equal citizen rights, and 15th Amendment, which gave all men the right to vote, in spite of race, in spite of race, in spite of race, in spite of race, oh, and in spite of background. In spite of background. In spite of background. The government also formed the Freedmen's Bureau to try and help African Americans get jobs, housing, education, and medical care. The South attempted to resist political and social reforms by placing racist black codes to keep African Americans segregated and ensure that most Africans stayed working on plantations as sharecroppers. I'm actually the child of a sharecropper. That's not a part of the story, that's a true fact. Southerners also formed racist groups like the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, and white literacy tests and grandfather clauses. Oh, I'm so sorry. And White League to intimidate African Americans and keep them from voting with poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. I'm so sorry. Reconstruction ended in 1877 with the controversial presidential election in which the South claimed Samuel Tilden won and North claimed Rutherford B. Hayes won. The South allowed the North's Rutherford B. Hayes to become president in return for the North agreeing to pull all federal troops out of the South and end all Reconstruction policies. This is Mr. Bill's part of the story, not Monsieur Balque's. After that, everyone lived happily ever after. Not really, but we're working on it. Now that's where this class ends, but I want all of you to understand that every day we are going through amazing changes in our history. I'm Christian, so don't get mad at me for saying this, but I thank God that I was able to live in a time where we could see so much change happen in such a short period of time. If you're triggered by stuff, I suggest you ask Mr. Bills to stop playing. Like, we had the George Floyd movement, Black Lives Matter. We had the Stop Asian Hate movement. We had the anti-wall movement. We've had so much going on. We're in a pandemonium, pandemic, and so many things that have happened. The first president to be impeached twice. One of the first presidents to so heavily contest the vote count and repeatedly lose. And I think, like I said, I thank God that I'm allowed to live in a time like this. It's so stressful and it's sad, but we can see honest progress. And my kudos go out to Mr. Bills and Mr. Monto and all the history teachers who are actively making comments on what's going on. And I want all of you to feel very special, because right now, not only are you living history, you're making history. God bless. I pray all of you have a blessed rest of your day. Bye-bye now.